Alrighty, so I'm going to be talking about accessibility in game development and design today. My name is Tristan Barber. I'm also known as Wolf Online. My Twitter is @WolfGameDev, and I am the studio director and CEO of Watercress. Alongside management Watercress, I am a lead writer, so I do a lot of writing and editing, and I also have been the creative director on over half of our projects, and I also do a lot of our marketing. Disclaimer, first off, I'm not an accessibility expert, so this is meant to be more of a jumping off point than an end-all be-all presentation. It's from my own research and experiences and should be treated as such. Also, there is much more to accessibility than I can reasonably cover within the 20-minute restriction. So really, this is introduction. I already have like 30 slides. I can't fit any more. Some background of the studio I work for and I run. Watercress is a developer and publisher for free or visual novels. We're founded in 2014. We have over 40 volunteers who work with us, and we have released over 12 games, or I have at least released over 12 games, Watercress around 10, 4 of them being on Steam. So an overview for the talk meeting today. First, I'm going to define accessibility. Then I'm going to get us started with accessibility. Then I'll talk about some of my own personal experiences relating to it. Then I'll talk about how it fits into the development process, what the mindset that you need to have going into it, and then some resources and sources at the end. So what is accessibility? It is the ability to access your game or really anything that people need to access. It could be ramps for buildings, but obviously for visual novels, it's going to be much more about accessibility for games. Accessibility tends to focus on people with special needs, but accessibility options benefit everyone. And if the game isn't accessible for you, the quote unquote average user, it definitely is not accessible for everyone else. And there is no such thing as an average or typical player of a game. An important stat to know going in is that, at least in the United States, 61 million adults live with a disability, 1 in 4. So accessibility really needs to be the norm, not the exception. Accessibility is related to universal design, if anyone knows that is, especially coders. It's about creating products that are usable by people with the widest range of abilities. This is for all peoples, regardless of need. And if the game fails universal design philosophies, it fails accessibility requirements. All games should be accessible to a game's target audience. So getting started with accessibility. You need to start at the design stage. Retrofitting projects with accessibility can be much more difficult than going into it with that mindset. It may be worthwhile to retrofit a project if you expect a larger player base in the future, or if you already have a pre-existing large player base. But if you have a project that is, say, 5 years old and hasn't had a download in 7 months, probably not worthwhile to retrofit. It's more important to focus on your future projects and current projects for accessibility. Also, explore accessibility options are relevant to your project. There is a massive Excel checklist that I'll be linking at the end of this talk that has pretty much everything that you will need for accessibility right now. There is no real accessibility standard yet. So this is probably the closest thing you'll be able to get to. Obviously, a lot of options for games accessibility aren't necessary for visual novels. Most visual novels don't have any 3D element. You click through them for the most part, but accessibility is still important for visual novels. Consider all accessibility options, not just disability options. I'll be talking about other accessibility options people don't think about, but a really good example of an accessibility option is inverted controls for console gaming. No one tends to think of inverted controls as an accessibility option, but it is. So things that allow people to play the game unimpeded, that's what accessibility is all about, and visual novels definitely require this. Again, remember, 25% of adults have a disability. If you don't have accessibility in your game and you don't develop it with accessibility in mind, then you're going to be losing at most 25% of your player base, which is 1 in 4, which is massive. I don't think anyone that makes visual novels for money wants to lose that much of their base, nor do volunteer devs want to lose that either. I'm going to give some examples of accessibility moving in. The first one is motor accessibility. Yeah, I've used the same slides for the last like 4 talks, 100%. So motor control mostly deals with user input. For visual novels, this is mostly ensuring playability with keyboard only, mouse only, touchscreen, and gamepad. Those are like the 4 big ones. Most visual novels out there actually can't be used with only keyboard or only mouse. And most can't be used with touchscreen at all in general. That's something you normally have to work on internally. And then obviously gamepad. If you use RenPy, most of these things are baked in. However, a lot of people, when they build their menus and such in RenPy, break this, and they don't realize that they're breaking this. So always go through your game personally with beta testers, with a QA force, with a community, especially accessibility communities that are more than happy to help. Ask them to play through your game. And that option that Knight has posted in Discord will be linked to the end of this talk. So make sure you play the game through. Make sure that it can work with keyboard only, mouse only, touchscreen, and gamepad. Also, QuickTime events, they can be very user unfriendly. There's a lot of people who absolutely hate QuickTime events, but QuickTime events aren't always evil. They are evil if they are required and they do not allow people to play your game. Not everyone has the reflexes to complete QuickTime events, and it is best to include an option that either negates QuickTime events or preferably slows down the reaction time required. People don't want to limit their experience, so removing QuickTime events altogether when they're intended can be negative to their playing experience. So it's best to have options to slow them down and make them easier while keeping the enjoyment of interacting with the game. My next example is cognitive accessibility. Mostly deals with processing information. The big thing is to disable clutter in your games. A really good example is if anyone's played League of Legends. League of Legends has graphics options to specifically disable clutter and allow you to have a very simple viewing experience. For visual novels specifically, this means that your UI should be simple, or at least you should be able to simplify it in the settings. You want to limit the amount of clicks you have by as much as physically possible. That means when you get into a game, say you want to start the game, it shouldn't take more than 1 or 2 clicks. And if you want to save the game from a play state, you want to be able to access the menu and then save straight from there, or at least a menu in there. Make sure you limit the amount of clicks you need. You don't want to have menus nested within menus. Include accessibility options in as many locations as reasonable. I will share some examples from one of our games for this. But generally speaking, your accessibility options should be something that pops up when you start your game. It should be something that appears on the main menu, and it should be something that you can see in the pause screen in game at the very least. And make interactables obvious. This includes things like hoverables and just image mapping on screen, things that make it obvious that things are meant to be interacted with. Oftentimes, this is just glowing, and it's important to have animation behind it so it catches your eye. This isn't only for people who need accessibility options. It's good graphics design all around. You also need to have hints, tips, tutorials, and summaries if the game warrants it. I know a lot of games like Persona 5 have in-game summaries that get updated as you go. That is really good. Definitely have that in your game if your game is long enough. Even like a 10,000 word game can warrant summaries. Also have bulleted lists or simplified text. Like this presentation, I try to keep it all in lists. This is specifically for anything that is in list format. Obviously, you're not writing your game in bulleted format, But if you consider the text box in visual novels to be a sort of list, keep in mind how much text you have in the text box. If it wraps around 3 times, so you have 3 lines of text, generally speaking, that's too much. And if you need to use NVL format instead of squishing all of your text into the small text box at the bottom of the screen. You also want to be able to disable animation in the options and have epilepsy warnings and options available. Another accessibility example is audiovisual and speech, mostly sight and hearing. Voice readers for the visually impaired is really important. RenPy has this right out of the gate, right out of the box. Use them, play your game, make sure they work. If you modify your menus, you might break this, so go through and play it with it on. Have a large font size and use sans serif fonts. Make sure dyslexia-friendly fonts are used. And this means you should play test the games with dyslexic readers, because just because a font says it's dyslexia friendly doesn't mean it actually is. Also include subtitles for the hearing impaired, especially for music and SFX that aren't already there. Because, visual novels have, it's novel, it has text, you can read it. But music and sound effects and ambience and stuff like that don't. There are tools that I'll be linking at the end as well for that, but you want to make sure you include those. If you have a game that requires speech input, it's nice, but should never be a full-on requirement. And when having speech input in a game, don't use long phrase requirements, and consider volume thresholds in place of word recognition. This helps not only for accessibility, but for people with accents. We've all seen really bad text-to-speech or speech-to-text with accents. So volume thresholds removes that possibility. Here is the one of the examples that I'm giving for Watercress. This is from a Steam game. This is for you. Obviously, this game has a lot of accessibility things that we don't do right. We've only recently gotten big into accessibility because we were pretty new to this stuff. But it includes subtitles in the settings screen. It includes subtitles when you first load the game. And this is what the subtitles look like. It's for the sound effects. And then another example that I wanted to give. Here is the text example for text speed, text outline, and text shadow. This is from Necrobarista. Really good job. We want to be able to modify the text in visual novels specifically so people can customize it and make sure they can read it themselves. So some other examples that people won't think of for accessibility. Phobia options, which I'll be sharing an example later in our next slide. But a lot of people don't think of phobias when they're making games. So having options to hide them or to modify them slightly will make the player experience better. Translations are also an accessibility option. People who cannot speak English or cannot read English and you have an English-only game, this game is not accessible to them. So if you can afford it or if you have the time, consider translations for your game. Obviously, there are a few translations that are more relevant than others. Translating a game into Japanese, Chinese, Russian, Spanish, or a European language in general will have more players than other languages, so keep those in mind. Also, keep your download size as low as physically possible. Another thing a lot of new developers don't think about. Metered connections exist, and people who have metered connections, if your game's too big, you're just losing them. They cannot play your game. You will not get the money from them. You will not get the playtime from them or the metrics. You're losing them straight up. So make sure that you have a download size that is reasonable. Don't include WAVs in your visual novel. For example, one of Watercress's older games, the director for that game accidentally included WAVs instead of OGGs, and it ballooned the game incredibly. Don't do that. Make sure all of your files are small and reasonable. Obviously, you want to keep quality as high as possible, but don't overdo it. And then another example of accessibility is gender and sexuality options. If it's workable in the narrative, allow pronoun choice. Anything involving gender and sexuality is a good thing to have if the game warrants it. So definitely think about that. There is Another example I'll have at the end, or another link at the end of the talk that will have some code for that. Here's the arachnophobia example from Grounded. I think they did a really good job of including this, because arachnophobia or Grounded it's not a game about spiders. It's a game about, being small and like it's a creating sim essentially. So having an option that allows players to play it without triggering their phobias is really important. And this box loads the first thing you get in the game. And then here are the options themselves. Here's an example of what it looks like. So my personal experience with accessibility, I have ADHD, larger text size helps with my focus, and manual and autosave options both help with my forgetfulness and allow me to come back to a game whenever my attention span wants to. Try to include those. And yeah, the spiders lost their legs. It's trying to keep the spiders in the game without hurting the player. I also have repetitive stress injury in my wrist. Gamepad options are a necessity for me. Key mapping that is wrist cast and split friendly is also nice. Anything that require wrist movement is damaging for me. So having things that require wrist movement, they're in basically everything. We all use mice, use your wrist for everything. So try to limit that as much as possible. I don't have to use a gamepad all the time, but after a long day of work, I will need to lay it off. There are times in my career where I've had to stop my work and delegate. When I used to split lines for Watercress and other studios, the tedious process of splitting the lines definitely caused a lot of damage. Things like that can be damaging, so make sure you're delegating. Accessibility in the development process. Development process needs to suit the developers. You need to make sure that when you're developing a game, all of the people you're working with can reasonably work on the game and also reasonably play the game. A lot of requirements are not obvious to the most abled person out there. So you need to make sure that the process works for the developers, not the other way around. Process is great, but it's not the end all be all. Consider the following. What tools are you using in your studio? What documentation do you have? Can all of your developers play the game to its fullest? And make sure you are constantly polling your developers. Many people who require accessibility options won't walk up to you and say, hey, I need this, or hey, this will help me a lot. People don't want to get in the way. It's your job, if you're the manager or the developer, the CEO, whatever, it is your job to make sure that everyone can work comfortably on the game you're making. Be it in your game or in the studio in general, whatever you're doing, make sure that your developers are comfortable and can do their jobs. Accessibility, time, and money. This is for people who make money. A lot of developers look at accessibility options and think, this is a lot of time investment that I'm putting in. This is money that I'm going to be spending. And that's true. Accessibility tools take time and money to develop. If you're using RenPy, thankfully, there are a lot of free tools and code out there to use, but accessibility isn't something that a lot of people think about, so it takes a lot of digging to find them. If developing without accessibility in mind is worth losing 25% of your profits, then maybe consider the compounding variables on top of that. Not only are you losing 25% of your profits, you're losing the faith of much of your community, and your marketing takes a huge hit. If your game is just utterly inaccessible to 25% of the community, people are going to see that, and that is going to hurt. So if you want to make money, accessibility is a requirement, not an addition. It is generally always worth the time investment and the monetary investment. As I said previously, older products don't have a player base. That will take a judgment call from you and your studio. Consider all of the above. If your game is so old that no one is playing it, maybe it's not worth it. But if adding accessibility options into an update would bring players back to your game, maybe it will be very worth it. So make sure you quantify that, you judge that, you make a decision accordingly. So one of the last things I want to talk about is the accessibility mindset. When developing, develop for your target audience, as we talked about last talk, not all games can be accessible to all people. For example, I play a lot of League of Legends. I don't expect League of Legends to have pure blind options. It's a competitive game. It requires a lot of teamwork in a 3D environment. You can do the best as you can, but some games just inherently won't be accessible. That doesn't mean that you should stop investing in those games and stop making those games. It is impossible to make a game for everyone. Make sure that your game is accessible to the largest amount of people as possible without sacrificing too much of your product. When developing, develop the accessibility as a requirement. Again, you don't want to erase 25% of your players. Recognize that everyone has quote unquote blinders. We are not omniscient people. Seek input from developers, beta testers, QA devs, the community, etc. Reach out to accessibility communities. They are very happy to help. We just don't know everyone else's experiences. We know what we experience and what we experience alone. So getting people in on your project, at the very least on a QA or testing level, is vital to ensure your game hits all those check marks, is accessible to everyone, or to the people who it needs to be accessible to. And accessibility is more than differently abled. Any barrier to play could be considered an accessibility issue. I bet most people in this chat or watching this talk have some sort of accessibility requirement, be it inverted controls, be it having a metered connection. A lot of these things that we don't think about impact your player base. So it is much more than just people you may not have, a lot of experience with. Accessibility is for you. Here is the first page of resources and sources. GameAccessibilityGuidelines.com is the closest we have to something regular for accessibility. There is an excellent Excel spreadsheet that you can access through the link. I'll be sharing these slides on my Twitter and in the chat as well. So make sure you check that out. If you're a developer, this list is wonderful. Another great simple resource for accessibility right here. A lot of these are just expansions on each other. And then here's an archive of an accessibility list with some comments. Page 2, I have a small playlist put together real quick that has some accessibility videos. DM me on Twitter for a collaboration link if you want to add new videos. Some of it are GDC talks, generally speaking. Oddly enough, the Wikipedia entry for game accessibility is pretty useful, so feel free to check that out. And then for some of the stats, I have the US CDC page for disability and health. And then my last source page, RenPy accessibility add-on pack by Minute, and pronoun tool pack and caption tool pack by NPCKC. And then just the documentation for RenPy. If you use RenPy, documentation is wonderful. Unfortunately, there's not like an accessibility section, but a lot of the accessibility options are in there. And we can go and move it over to Q&A.
Cool. Any questions, guys? Oh, so RenPy's like, can you plug the semi-hidden Shift-A menu?
Oh, the Shift-A menu? Oh, God, I'm sure. A lot of those options are something that RenPy Tom in the chat that he's just more equipped to answer about the tools.
There is a Shift-A menu, and when you use it, good stuff happens.
Yes, there are a lot of keys that you can press. The voicing key, press that when you're testing your game. I know that like the Microsoft voice might sound funny, but it's wonderful. Test that shit out.
Oh, please make your text boxes readable. Yeah. Question, do you have sites or resources where indie devs can solicit specific disability beta testing player bases?
I don't on hand. Most of the stuff I do is over Twitter, and there's a pretty large disability community on Twitter if you search for it. I can probably get some links later, but if you Google it, they're really easy to find. Yeah, thanks for anyone who links in the chat. That is super useful.
Cool. Also, we're gonna because we're a little short on time, we're going to have our next talk in 3 minutes. So now's a good time to ask questions and or grab a drink, go to the restroom, whatever you need to do. Just putting that out there. Okay, any other questions? Not seeing anything right now. But there are so many resources that we have to catch up on because you put up a ton of links.
Yeah, I once the Q&A is over, I'll just link all of them in the link chat, and I'll also link the Google Sheets as well to make it easier.
Cool, because yes, disability is a massive topic.
Yeah, I try to keep it as short and sweet as possible. It's way too much to talk about.
Yeah, we literally could spend an entire conference on that if we really wanted to.
Yeah, for sure.
So, well, you can squeeze it. I did want to mention that this and the world building talk were the two that were voted by the community. I forgot to mention that. I mean, it would have gotten in by itself, both of them. I would have chosen them already, but the community voted those in before I could get a chance to. So that was cool.
Yeah, I really appreciate those voted for this and for the world building. It's really good to talk about accessibility. A lot of people don't think about it. So the more we can talk about it, the better.
Yep, I agree.